we have looked at the philosophies of Hobbes and Locke. We have seen how those principles of the scientific revolution are starting to be applied to other realms of society. And what we're going to find out ultimately is that this has a massive, massive influence in the way culture happens in England. Now, since the English Enlightenment is the progenitor of this larger movement that's about to start expanding into Europe, we want to look very closely at that literature so that we can kind of understand exactly what was starting to be transmitted. And so let's start with what the fundamental part of the Enlightenment was, which is satire. Satire basically is comedy. It is showing what's wrong with society, but trying to do it in a very fun, silly, humorous way. And really, there's a couple reasons for this. For one thing, it's a great way not to get your head cut off, and don't underestimate the influence of that. If somebody disagreed with what you had to say in this period, don't forget, there were still plenty of kings and queens running around who'd have been more than happy to execute you for your treason. So, the scholars of this period and the writers were actually quite clever in that they realized we're going to do this kind of in a joking way, because that way, if the aristocracy or the leaders got angry with you for what you had to say, you could always just say, "Can't you take a joke?" You could always back off and just play it off as something that you didn't mean as serious. Now, of course, though, the real beauty of this kind of humor is that people can read into it, and they do recognize when you're mocking people. And that's exactly what was happening with this satire. And there were a couple of things that the intellectuals were especially concerned about. They actually looked at English society, and of course we're going to generalize this to European society starting next week. And they realized that things were just going downhill. All right, like the average people were just getting darn lazy, and there was all this alcoholism and waste, and just wow, society was terrible. And so these intellectuals sought to point this out to people so that they could try to basically turn the tide of all these negative traits. And so they wrote about people doing horrible things in a mocking way, so that we could laugh at the silliness, laugh at the people who were stupid and ineffectual, and maybe just maybe realize that we should act in a different way ourselves. Now, what's interesting is that the intellectuals were so concerned about how things were going down. The irony is that the average person actually was pretty happy with how things were going. This was the age of the Industrial Revolution, where all of a sudden there were a lot more people with jobs. Money was flowing a little bit more easily. There was massive trade all around the world. So actually, from like a massive standpoint, the general quality of living was actually on the rise, which is good. But the upper echelons of the intellectual community thought that the Industrial Revolution was bringing so much negative with it that perhaps we needed to reconsider. Now, this satire came to dominate basically every field of artistic endeavor, including paintings and art, including literature, and of course including music. So let's take a peek through these different areas and see what happened. One thing you're going to notice as you continue through your cultural exploration of Europe is that poor England is not known for its painters. Whenever there is some sort of important English contribution to culture, 9 times out of 10 it is going to be literary in nature. That's why we get Shakespeare. That's why we get all the poets. That's why we get the satire that we're going to look at. But there are some exceptions to that, and one gentleman that is noteworthy from this period is a guy named Hogarth. Now, what you see before you is one of his most famous pieces. And literally, you see satire just all over the place in this particular piece. For example, let's start right smack dab in the middle. You see a woman there with her shirt just hanging wide open. Presumably she was just breastfeeding, and that's why. She has a very charmed, pleasant look on her face, which is probably alcohol-induced in some way. And as you can see, she has not been the least bit able to hang on to her baby, which is why he is falling over the edge of the staircase and is probably going to sustain some sort of major head injury in just a moment. Now, obviously, you can't, read too much into this about the dangers of alcoholism. Not only are you going to be sitting around half naked in the streets of London, you're probably going to lose your child at the end. Obviously not a good thing. Now, at the bottom of that staircase, you see another gentleman sitting there. He is holding a bottle of alcohol in his left hand, if you notice. It's inside the basket. And when you actually look at him, he too has his shirt just spread wide open. But instead of, breastfeeding a child, he is absolutely skeletal. He is literally starving to death in the streets of London. And as you can see, there is nobody around that seems to be paying the least little bit of attention to him. This was a time when that could happen, and nobody would necessarily rush to his aid. Now, the rest of the painting is kind of in the backdrop. And again, it's a pretty creepy scene when you start going through it. Look all the way to the left, first of all. There is right above the little brick wall there's two people and a dog, and it seems like the person is fighting with the dog for a bone. That speaks to starvation in the streets again, just like our skeletal friend on the stairs. Behind them are two people basically trying to pawn things to that man. Okay, and that face is so strange. It's unclear if he's wearing a mask or just is really unpleasant. But here he is, a pawnbroker, and you look at their clothing, you can tell that they're obviously destitute. Their clothes are in rags. They're trying desperately to sell something to him, and so forth. Now, over to the other side, as you continue going, it gets creepier and creepier. In the very middle of the piece, right above the drunken woman's head, you see a coffin where they're actually putting bodies into it. And behind that, there is all kinds of, kind of lackadaisical, haphazard buildings that don't seem to be in very good repair. There's a lot of broken roofs. There's a lot of just random wood everywhere. And if you notice right above that, there's even a building that's it almost looks like it's falling over, and little pieces of the wood and the brick and everything else are just literally falling off of it. This, in many ways, I think is an homage to Christopher Wren with everything he was doing after the Great Fire. Kind of how just haphazardly so much was being thrown back together. And just to kind of add to the strangeness factor, if you look all the way in the upper right-hand corner, you actually see a gentleman who hanged himself, still dangling from the rafter beams in that upper building. Everywhere you look throughout this piece, every single piece of it is speaking to the destitution, the alcoholism, the poverty, the death, all the negative things that the intellectuals were so concerned about in this period, and basically just how little people seem to care that all these horrible things are taking place. Now, this is another piece by Hogarth. This is actually a courtroom, and you don't have to look too hard in this to see that this, too, is rather mocking of the court system. Basically, the expression you would use for something like this is a kangaroo court, or it's a court where, yes, all this stuff is taking place, but it's almost laughable how ridiculous it is. You can see at the very top, there's the judge, his wig. In England, they always wear those silly little wigs. It's literally flying off. He is playing with these little puppets, right? Which kind of tends to suggest that he's the one in charge and everything else. And of course, the fact that one of those puppets looks like a devil is pretty sad, pretty crazy. And then when you look down on the actual courtroom scene itself, it's crazy. You see someone drinking in the background. You can see, that it's kind of just overwhelmed with noise and chaos and everything else. There's even a dog in there singing. Obviously this is not a good place to be trying to get a real court, a real hearing for your case. Now, the literature, as is normal, is really where England makes its major contribution here. And essentially, the era of the Enlightenment is what many scholars claim is the era that gave birth to the novel. Now, there had been longer pieces of work up till now, but never anything that totally fits kind of what we today view as a novel, like an inclusive standalone story that has development, character, and so forth. Now, that is, of course, very debatable, but many people point to Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe as kind of these first true authors that invent this whole new style of writing. Now, we are actually going to be looking at another excerpt of Jonathan Swift, one of his shorter pieces known as A Modest Proposal. But he is probably most famous for Gulliver's Travels, and you may have even seen the film of this. They've made many adaptations through the years. But this is basically the story of an Englishman who goes out on a journey and comes across a land where everyone's really small, and basically he becomes the hero because of all the things he can do as a giant that they cannot do as teeny little people. And it literally is a very telling critique of basically English society and the way people are functioning, just an expectation that someone else is going to take care of them. Now, along the same lines, we get a book from Daniel Defoe known as Robinson Crusoe, and hopefully you've heard of this story. You definitely should read it. This is the famous shipwreck story, okay, where what happens to an Englishman when his ship sinks in the middle of the ocean and he is the only survival that is swept ashore a deserted island. What's going to happen to that typical Englishman when all of a sudden he has to take care of himself out in the mysterious unknown islands? And of course, he's going to run into pirates and cannibals and all kinds of other horrible things. But basically, you can see from these that they are taking their reader to other lands, to other areas, because when you're doing satire, that's a much safer way to go than keeping it in England. And they're going elsewhere, and they're basically exploring what it means to be English and pointing out societal flaws and even celebrating a few societal benefits, but just to kind of show you a critique of modern society, as modern being, of course, the Enlightenment age. Now, there are two artists, or I should say writers, that I really want us to focus on here. The first one is a man named Alexander Pope. Now, he is an English poet, and he is famous for something known as heroic couplets, all right? And that's a very exciting term. Basically, all it means is that he wrote everything in rhymes. Like, where literally every 2 lines rhymed, and then the next 2 lines would have a different rhyme, and then the next one a different rhyme, and so forth. So when you're reading his work, sometimes it seems a little sing-songy because of that, because of the rhyme scheme that's so heavy. But he was actually massively important. And he was a really interesting guy for a couple of reasons. First of all, he was physically deformed and he was a Catholic. Okay, both of these things would have gotten him into big trouble in England in the Enlightenment age. Okay, he basically had almost like a humpback. And because of that, when he was a child, he basically didn't go out very much because he was mocked so horribly, by the other children and the other people. This was certainly a long time before our modern day, understanding of physical deformities and so forth. And so he became very introspective, and he would stay home and write and so forth because he was shy, basically, to go out. But even though he didn't go out very often, he still was kind of very aware of what was going on. Like, he got a lot of news, I assume, from his parents and so forth. And he developed this amazing incisive wit that he could really kind of cut through the crap of what was going on around him and really see the truth of it and comment on it in a very intellectual way. Now, the other problem that Pope had was that he was Catholic. Believe it or not, Catholicism, anybody who practiced Catholicism in this period, was actually not allowed to participate in a lot of parts of society. They weren't allowed to graduate from college. They weren't allowed to hold any sort of official positions in the government. They had all kinds of, really, just negative biases against them that they had to deal with. And so basically, he had 2 big whammies against him. That basically made him, I think, even more critical of the society around him. And like all the other people we've been looking at, he used humor to basically point out just really how screwed up things are, the way we look at it. Now, he wrote a number of really famous pieces, and most of them were absolutely hysterical. His most famous piece was an essay on man, though, and this is actually a serious piece that includes satirical elements to it, but for a very serious purpose, because he's trying to look at what should man's true purpose on life be. And you don't get much more serious than that, right? I mean, that's pretty big. And one of the most famous lines from that piece, I've actually excerpted down there for you. It says, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man." And what that basically is saying is so important that, our job on this earth is to know ourselves. We have to figure out what we are like personally, which means we don't need to worry about trying to understand God. We don't need to do anything like that. We need to study each other. We need to focus on what's going to happen, with each other. And this is such a massive worldview shift from what has been basically the dominating force since the fall of Rome over 1,000 years ago. That, it's fine to study God, but it's more important to study ourselves. And this is a big part of that, Italian Baroque, that decline that we have already talked about in the power of the Christian church is continuing on. And this Enlightenment thinking that we need to study man, that we need to actually focus on ourselves, is really going to be changing up how we operate in the modern world. Now, the other major writer I want to look at is a woman, yay for us, and she's, of course, extremely popular nowadays, which is wonderful, and that's, I'm so happy when I see people reading her novels, and her name, of course, is Jane Austen. Now, she, of course, was writing about different things. Now, as a woman, the fact that she could actually publish novels and everything else was pretty astounding. She was not always able to take claim for her work. Most of her works were initially published just written by a lady and kept anonymous because she would have been ostracized in society for actually writing down her own thoughts. But what is really special and unique about her is that she was basically looking at a woman's role in society, which essentially was get married and have babies, and get married the best you can so that you have somebody who can afford to give you even more babies. Now, because of that, she was basically looking at like the way men and women interact. She was looking at relationships. She was looking at love. She was looking at things that nowadays are really popular topics. But back in this period, that was really not as common. And what was equally uncommon with what Jane Austen was doing was that she was writing really strong females. She wasn't putting women down. She wasn't saying that they were dumb and deserved to only stay at home and everything else. She was showing women for what they really are, which are intelligent and capable, that were basically dealing with the lot in life that they had based in their society. But she, even though she only wrote 6 novels, which was not that much in her lifetime, she is still enduring as one of the most popular writers of all time. In fact, Pride and Prejudice, which is her most famous work, is celebrating its 200th anniversary and is still one of the most popular pieces of literature of all time. That's pretty astounding when you consider it was written by a lady who couldn't even be allowed to put her own name on the book for fear of retribution. Now, not all the writing was literary in nature. We already looked, of course, at Locke and Hobbes, so I know you know about the philosophical stuff that was going on, but there was other sorts of writing happening as well, and Adam Smith is probably the most famous example of what else was going on. He was an economist, and Adam Smith was actually looking at this industrial revolution. He was looking at all these factories, looking at what was happening in the world. And he basically said, you know what? You know what I see? The more something costs, the fewer people can buy it. You know what else I see? If there's a lot of something out there that's available, the price better be pretty cheap or you won't be able to sell yours. Like all these sorts of principles that, again, we totally take for granted because we have grown up in a capitalist country and we understand supply and demand and, the consumerism and all that kind of stuff. Basically, Adam Smith was the first person to ever notice it. And I always find it amusing because a lot of people say that Adam Smith invented capitalism. He didn't invent anything. He just looked around England and he described what he saw and named it capitalism. It's not like he sat down and he said, let's do this. It organically had developed by itself, and he just basically gave it a name. Now, he did describe a few economic principles that are still something we talk about today, and you need to be comfortable with. He looked at something called enlightened self-interest, that basically, as say I own a factory. Obviously, I'm self-interested. I want to make as much money as I possibly can so that I can have a nice house and a nice family and I can afford to take care of everything I need to take care of. That's true for everyone, no matter whether you're a factory owner or a factory worker, wherever you are on the ladder. We have self-interest, right? However, enlightened self-interest is the concept that I can't be absolutely selfish in everything I do, because ultimately that's going to be self-defeating. If I'm a factory owner and I, pay, my factory workers absolutely nothing, I make them work 20 hours a day, I, don't give them any days off, everything else. If I'm horrible, what's going to happen eventually is that no one's going to work for me. Right? And if that happens, then my factory isn't going to be able to function. I am not going to be able to keep making the money I want to make. That would be very self-defeating. Okay, so he said you have to be aware of that. You obviously want to do the best you can for yourself, but by definition, that means also that you have to, help out others at the same time, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to continue functioning. Now, he also came up with something that he called the invisible hand. And this basically is the idea that government should stay the heck out of economics, all right? That the market takes care of itself. If people don't want to buy your car, they're not going to buy your car. It's not going to take you too long to figure out you should stop making your car, right? And his idea is that whenever the government actually got involved with that it actually screwed things up. And that is why we would run into issues like recessions and depressions and so forth. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing, especially when you think about our modern age where we have been suffering so much from recessions lately. Maybe the government's getting too involved. Adam Smith would certainly say that's a problem. Now, the other thing that comes along from this is the fancy term for that, which is laissez-faire, which again basically just means let things go. The market will be by itself. It's fine. Even though he wrote all these ideas down, his famous book is called Wealth of Nations, and that's basically where he outlined this is what capitalism is. This is what just kind of organically developed in England. A lot of people did start to carry it well beyond his original intent. And so like nowadays you hear a lot of times people say, oh, capitalism is evil. It's the root of all the problems we have in the world. He would, what he actually intended and what he talked about was a very small component that has been kind of taken by people and run with. So be a little bit cautious before you start just kind of blanket stating that capitalism is evil, because certainly it was just a thing. It was just a way of interacting. It takes people to make stuff evil, doesn't it? Now, the last little thing I want us to look at from this period was the music of it. Now, we didn't talk too much about it in the Baroque period, but I did point out that the Baroque age was the age of opera. That basically this is where we get wild, dramatic, beautiful music, where people would literally riot if the show sold out or if it didn't, continue on for another week and so forth. And so that was what was happening on the continent, especially in Italy. What was happening in England was, again, this new changing culture. Enlightenment is all about rationalism. It's all about control, and it's all about, logic, basically. Well, that is going to start influencing the music of the age. And the most famous English Enlightenment guy that you need to know is a guy named Handel, George Frederick Handel. Now, what's interesting is that even though I'm talking to him right now, we're talking about him right now in the English Enlightenment, he was actually a German. This is a situation where England kind of looked around. They said, we don't have any good English composers here. Let's go steal one. And so literally they found who they thought was the best composer of the age. He happened to be living in Germany. They offered him a lot of money. And next thing you know, all of a sudden he's writing for England. And that was kind of common in this period where different countries would steal from each other whenever they had a chance. Now, Handel's music, it's really famous. You actually know it. You just don't realize you know it. But his most famous piece is known as The Messiah. And he wrote in a style that was known as the oratorio. This was a new style of music. It was kind of like opera. So it was very passionate and wild, and it told a story and all that stuff. But unlike Italian opera, there were no actors, so they weren't actually acting it out on stage the way you would. Literally, it would be just like a chorus singing the story to you. And they didn't decorate it. It was a much more kind of stripped down form of opera. Basically, it's like going to a movie, but the movie just being a bunch of guys sitting around reading their lines and, to it, as opposed to actually acting it out in front of you. And so with all this, shift now taking place, this focus on rationalism, this focus on satire, this focus on basically evaluating the world in a new way based on kind of scientific principles, it's going to start spreading. Even though England starts it, it is not going to be contained for very long. And what's going to start to happen now is these ideas are going to cross the channel. They're going to invade France and Germany and the rest of Europe. And we are going to see how the rest of Europe responds to this new rationalism.